a friend observed the other day. He gave me a year ago. He gave me one of those bathroom readers on Canadian trivia, and so he said, "Yeah, you get reading that, and then the whole next year, your church will be subjected to Canadian trivia." And but I'm departing from Canadian trivia, though. What I have been reading recently is I've been listening to an audiobook on English history. So I thought we'd start off. We were actually just talking about the King James translation, so I thought we'd start off this morning talking about King James himself, or rather his wife, actually. So you don't know, King James lived around the 1600s. The King James Version actually came out in 1611, I believe. So it was originally commissioned in 1603. And King James the First of England, the Sixth of Scotland, was a kind of a religious, took a great deal of interest in the religious life of England. And so that was part of his desire to have this translation done. What he wasn't really excited about was romance. He was really known as not a very romantic guy. And so he, like a lot of kings at that time, got married for political reasons. It was sort of arranged for him. He married a princess from Denmark by the name of Anne. The families had discussed it, and then when she got to the ripe old age of 14 and was ready to be married, they shipped her off to England with her retinue. Of course, the crossing of the North Sea, has never been easy, but at that time was perilous. And so a big storm blew in, and they actually had to land on the coast of Norway, or else their ship was going to be wrecked. And so King James, in what is described as the only romantic episode of his life, actually got on a ship with some of his court, and they went and actually rescued her when word reached them that her ship had sort of crash landed in Norway, and so they brought her back to England. So it wasn't that was kind of the only romantic episode in their courtship, and so they did have children, of course, after that, but it just wasn't a big part of James's life, this marriage relationship, keeping the home fires burning. And in fact, it also, of course, there was a divide between them, because they had been married for political reasons, but actually one of the differences they had was in their religion. And so, of course, James by this point was the head of the Anglican Church, the English church that had been formed about 70 years earlier in England, and he was the head as its king. But Anne of Denmark, they were Presbyterians in Denmark, and so that was kind of a difference for them. They were both Protestants, protesters against the Catholic Church when they got married, but when she came over to England, she encountered Catholics, actually, and is likely to have believed to have become a Catholic during her time. And this didn't really ingratiate herself to James, who thought he knew a lot about religion, and actually, even just not from a political standpoint, but from a religious standpoint, from a political standpoint, it kind of was undermining to their relationship. It was dangerous for Anne to become a Catholic. People became very anxious and worried. Of course, James's mother, who reigned before him, was Mary, Queen of Scots, who was famously Catholic and actually tried to undo all of everything that her forefather Henry had done in establishing the Anglican Church. And so people were really worried when word got out that Queen Anne was secretly a Catholic and had a Catholic priest coming into the private chapel in the royal palace and conducting mass for her. This was really worrisome. And we might look at that and kind of wonder, she's a 14-year-old girl, might have been in her 20s by the time she converted. But the queen really, we think about in our time the prince consort, the late prince consort, Prince Philip. We think of the spouse of the ruling monarch as being sort of a sideline thing, but certainly in King James's day, it was implicitly understood that even if they were not getting along well together, the queen had influence. She could direct things behind the scenes, even though, formally her title didn't allow her to a lot of authority. Informally, she held sway with the king because of her position. And so that's what worried people. And I bring that up because I think they understood something intuitively that sometimes we miss, is that there's all kinds of authority in this world. Some of it formalized, and we give people titles, but a lot of it informal. A lot of us are able to influence the decisions that people make, the choices that they make, just because of our relationship. And I think at some level we all understand this somewhat. I don't think I grasped until I had kids how much it's like the parents are training the children, but the children are also training us. We all have to live together at some point, right? I'm surprised at how much Argyle directs my life on a day-to-day basis, despite having very few words. I think we all have the power to create a change in our world, whether we know it or not, whether we're the King of England or we're washing dishes in our home. And so this morning we're carrying on our series of women in the Bible, and I wanted to we've been going in one direction a little bit with this series, and I'm going to quite purposely take a step in the other direction. If we did a whole series on women in the Bible and they were entirely positive portraits, you'd say, well, there's obviously some bias there. And so I wanted to give full scope. And so this morning we're looking at a character by the name of Jezebel. And so hopefully, despite it maybe not being a positive picture, I think there's something for us to learn there in terms of the fact that we all have influence, and Jezebel was a figure that was very influential in the history of Israel. And so let's crack open our Bibles to 1 Kings if you've got one in front of you. We're going to be there this morning. So who was Jezebel is our first where we're going to start off. Well, she was a queen, just like Queen Anne. She was brought in from a foreign country to marry the king of Israel. And so this is after King David, King Solomon, and so there's a short civil war that takes place in King Solomon's son's time, and so the nation divides in half. The northern kingdom of Israel retains the name. The southern kingdom of Judah retains the temple and Jerusalem. And so this is taking place in the northern kingdom of Israel. And so I'm just going to pick up, we're kind of introduced in Scripture to Jezebel and her husband Ahab in 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 29. So I'm going to just read that short introduction there. It says, in the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, Ahab, son of Omri, became king of Israel, and he reigned in Samaria over Israel 22 years. Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. He not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, that was the first king of this northern kingdom of Israel, but he also married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and began to serve Baal and worship him. He set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal that he built in Samaria. Ahab also made an Asherah pole and did more to arouse the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than did all the kings of Israel before him. So Queen Jezebel comes to Israel from Sidon. That's a near neighbor to the northern kingdom of Israel. They're on the Mediterranean coast there. They are really sort of the prototypical city-state in the ancient Near East. It's mainly the capital city of Sidon and sort of the surrounding territory of it. They're a smaller kingdom, but they're fairly wealthy because they're a port on the Mediterranean, and so they take advantage of trade there. And Jezebel comes from there. And of course, they have their own religion there. And the main religion is, the two main deities are Baal and sort of his consort, Asherah. Now, Baal is a fertility god. He's seen as the storm god of that place. He rules over the weather. in that region, at least according to his worshipers, and he brings especially the seasonal rains that people were so dependent on in that area. Even today, actually, in Israel, water scarcity is probably one of the main underlining factors, actually, in conflict between Palestine and Israel, is who gets the water. It's very scarce in Palestinian territories, and they have large public swimming pools, outdoor pools and things like that in Israel. There's an abundance of it there. But it's largely dependent on seasonal rain, especially in agriculture. And of course, at the time of King Ahab, most of the country would be dependent on income from agriculture, or just food from agriculture, of course, to put food on the table. And so the worship of Baal really surrounded seasonal changes, rain coming. It was a fertility worship, and so actually the worship of the temples was highly sexual. They had temple prostitutes, and it was, I know, surprising. And it was detestable to the God of Israel. So it really wasn't something that could be countenanced in Israel. But of course, it comes and enters in. And part of the sort of one of the subtexts going through the books of 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Samuel is the comparison of the kings against what the book of Deuteronomy teaches in its little bit that it includes in chapter 17 on what a king ought to do. And one of the quintessential lessons that even Solomon falls short of in Deuteronomy 17:17 is don't marry foreign wives, because Moses says they will corrupt you. They will lead you astray, and that's precisely what happens to Ahab. So he marries Jezebel. She imports Baal worship with her. And of course, as we just read in 1 Kings, that really undermines the religious life in a significant way in the northern tribe of Israel. Another thing that's going on in 1st and 2nd Kings, we've got this comparison with Deuteronomy. There's also sort of this pause in the book of 1st Kings that really slows down the action. So if you think of 1st and 2nd Samuel, largely what it is actually the description of King David coming to the throne. The process of that taking place. Like you think of the amount of time that actually passes there, it's quite short. But most of it has to do a highlight of David. In Kings, we get a list, of course, of all the kings of Israel and Judah. But a lot of the material sort of pauses when two prophets come on the scene. First, Elijah, and then his disciple or trainee, successor, Elisha. And so right here in 1 Kings, actually 17, is when Elijah is introduced to us. And the action suddenly slows down. We get from, clipping through, 50 years at a time with each king, getting, a few sentences describing it. From 1 Kings 17 to about 2 Kings 7 or 8, somewhere around there, we get a slowdown, and we hear a lot about suddenly Elijah and Elisha. And why this is taking place is really what the author of this is trying to do is saying the kings, especially of Israel, were so corrupt, were so irreligious, were so taken with foreign gods that God had to send somebody else in their place to point people toward God. And that's how these prophets rise up, to sort of fill that vacuum. And so there's a comparison that takes place between Ahab especially and Elijah. Ahab is so swayed by Jezebel into false worship of Baal that he is then, of course, contrasted with Elijah. Now, interestingly, we're introduced to Elijah in 17. We're told about a famine that comes on the land of Israel. This would be, to anybody that was worshiping Baal, famine was the death of their god. And so it wasn't until rains returned that they would believe that Baal was powerful again, was alive and active in their world. And so Elijah pronouncing a drought coming on the land because of because of the worship of Baal is really a direct attack on that. But then interestingly, we might be familiar with this, Elijah then goes to the Kerith ravine and is fed by ravens there for a while, and then the ravine dries up, and he goes to a widow at a town named Zarephath. And interestingly, this widow turns out to be have quite a bit of faith in Elijah and his God. And of course, it's an interesting miracle story there, but I think it's included here because of its location particularly. Zarephath is right in the middle of the Sidonian territory. It's part of the kingdom of Sidon. And so here's this lowly widow, this poor woman who barely has food to put on the table, who expresses her faith in God Jehovah, the God of Israel. And then, of course, in the next chapter, we contrast that, the next chapter, we contrast that with Jezebel, this woman from Sidon who has no faith in God, but all her faith is in this false god, Baal. But before we skip to 18 and get to what's going on there, I just want to take note of when this was all taking place. Of course, there's the famine that's going on in the land we just mentioned in verse 1 of chapter 17, but the verse before that has an interesting little biographical note. Now, when Joshua, who had led the people into the promised land, had conquered Jericho. Jericho's the oldest city in the world, actually, that's been continuously lived in. When they conquered Jericho, of course, the walls were destroyed. And when you destroy a city's walls at that time, it really turns you from a safe haven for people to come into from the country to just a little village that any, nighttime robber can make his way into. And so you're kind of wiped off the map at that point. You might still exist as a little village, but it's never going to be the same. So Joshua pronounces a curse actually on Jericho, and he says, whoever rebuilds this town, bad things are going to happen. Particularly their children are going to die. And so this comes actually to fruition here in 1 Kings 16:34. It says, in Ahab's time, Hiel of Bethel rebuilt Jericho, which is to mean mainly he rebuilt the walls. It says he laid its foundations at the cost of his firstborn son, Abiram, and he set up its gates at the cost of his youngest son, Segub. In case anybody's searching for names for children, you can write those down. In accordance with the word of the Lord spoken by Joshua, son of Nun. And why is this even mentioned? This is a book about kings. Why is there this random biographical note? Well, I think it's included to give us sort of a sign of the times. This is the time that Ahaz and Jezebel are living in. Everybody's worshiping Baal, and particularly life is cheap. Baal in another form, he takes different names. In Sidon, he's called Baal. In the southern part of Judah, the Canaanites living there called him Baal of Peor because they worshipped him on the mountain of Peor. To the east in Moab, it was the same god, but he was called Chemosh. And in Moab in particular, they would worship Chemosh by sacrificing their children to this god. And so life was cheap, especially for people that worshipped Baal. In contrast to that, then, of course, we have Elijah and Elisha, who seem to go out of their way to save people, and particularly children. This widow at Zarephath, her child will become sick in other chapters, and it's one of the big miracles of Elijah's time that he brings him back from the dead. And so there's this contrast then that those that are faithful to the Lord are, hold life in high regard. So that was when Jezebel was alive. What did she do, actually, though? That's what we want to look at this morning, of course, is, she had influence. And what did she do with her influence? What did she do with her power? And probably the most well-known incident in Ahab's reign, in her reign, comes in chapter 18 of 1 Kings. And this is the showdown between the prophets of Baal with the prophet Elijah on Mount Carmel. So basically, Elijah goes into hiding before this because he pronounces drought on the land of Israel until the king repents, which he doesn't really. So finally, God relents and sends Elijah to one of the court officials and says, "Here I am," basically. And this court official, he's probably like the prime minister, essentially, of Israel. And he's been searching the land for years for Elijah. Nobody can find him. And so he's actually kind of worried just that Elijah showed up. He worries for his own life if he has to be the one to take the message to the king. But he finally convinces him to. Let's pick it up at verse 16 of chapter 18. So Obadiah, this is the court official, went to meet Ahab and told him, and Ahab went to meet Elijah. When he saw Elijah, he said to him, "Is that you troubler of Israel?" "I have not made trouble for Israel," Elijah replied, "but you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals. Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." So that's both a term of subsistence that she's providing for their food and drink. She's providing lodging for them. It's also sort of a stamp of official approval to say this is sort of my inner circle, these 850 foreign priests. So they eat, and notice it's not eating at the king's table, it's eating at Jezebel. So that's, I think, significance in the text. So Ahab went throughout all Israel and assembled the prophets on Mount Carmel. Elijah went before the people and said, "How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. And if Baal is God, follow him." But the people said nothing. Then Elijah said to them, "I am the only one of the Lord's prophets left." Which wasn't true, but we'll let him have it this time. "But Baal has 450 prophets. Get 2 bulls for us. Let Baal's prophets choose one for themselves, and let them cut it into pieces and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by fire, he is God." Now Baal's title here is kind of interesting. You notice actually even when we read the name of Jezebel's father, the king of Sidon, Baal was included in his name. And part of that is because it was actually a term that was probably similar to what we would translate Lord. You know, as we refer to the Lord, God, Jehovah, we can also talk about, English lords, people who own horses and, ride in armor, were sometimes referred to as Lord. And in the same way, the term Baal kind of had the same sort of semantic range in that day. And so this is a classic showdown that Elijah has set up, because they're both claiming to be the Lord, essentially, in their language. Who's going to come out on top? Then all the people said, "What you say is good." So Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, "Choose one of the bulls and prepare it first, since there are so many of you. Call on the name of your God, but do not light the fire." So they took the bull and given them and prepared it. Then they called on the name of Baal from morning till noon. "Baal, answer us," they shouted. But there was no response. No one answered. And they danced around the altar they had made. Now at noon, Elijah began to taunt them. "Shout louder," he said. "Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he's sleeping and you must be awakened." Little bit of humor from Elijah. So they shouted louder and began to slash themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. Midday passed, and they continued their frantic prophesying until the time for the evening sacrifice. But there was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Come here to me." They came to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord which had been torn down. Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, Your name shall be Israel. With the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he dug a trench around it, large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. So that's the equivalent of 24 pounds. So it can hold a fair bit of water, basically. He arranged the wood, cut the bowl into pieces, and laid it on the wood. Then he said to them, Fill 4 large jars with water, and pour it on the offering and on the wood. Do it again, he said, and they did it again. Do it a 3rd time, he ordered, and they did it the 3rd time. The water ran down around the altar and even filled up the trench. At the time of the sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and prayed, Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant, and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord. Answer me so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also even licked up the water in the trench. When all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. Then Elijah commanded them, Seize the prophets of Baal. Don't let anyone get away. They seized them, and Elijah had them, brought down to the Kishon Valley and slaughtered there. And Elijah said to Ahab, Go, eat and drink, for there is the sound of a heavy rain. So Ahab went off to eat and drink, but Elijah climbed to the top of Mount Carmel. This is where this is all taking place. That's on sort of the northwest corner of Israel, and it overlooks the Mediterranean Sea. He bent down to the ground there and put his face between his knees. Go and look toward the sea, he told his servant. And he went up and looked. There's nothing, he said. 7 times Elijah said, Go back. From the body language, we're assuming he's praying at this point. The 7th time, the servant reported, A cloud as small as a man's hand is rising from the sea. So Elijah said, Go and tell Ahab, Hitch up your chariot and go down before the rain stops you. Meanwhile, the sky grew black with clouds. The wind rose. A heavy rain started falling, and Ahab rode off to Jezreel. The power of the Lord came on Elijah, and tucking his cloak into his belt, he ran ahead of Ahab all the way to Jezreel. Jezreel is the capital city, essentially, of Samaria at this point, or Israel, I should say. Now Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them. In other words, you've got 24 hours to live, Elijah. So what did Jezebel do? Well, it wasn't just making a threat. As we read, all of these prophets of Baal and even the prophetesses of Asherah had royal sanction, and particularly from Jezebel. The text tells us they ate at her table. Now, I don't want to be too harsh on her. You can kind of get the impression from this chapter in particular, like they'd never heard of Baal before, and she suddenly just overran the country with Baal. That's not true. Baal worship, of course, began for the Israelites. They were introduced to it before they even entered the Promised Land. Moses takes them to task for worshiping Baal of Peor, as he's called in Deuteronomy, because, of course, they're on the southern border of Israel at that point. And Baal worship comes up like a weed that will not die in the garden from time to time throughout their history from that point on. Particularly through the book of Judges, of course, we know that whole book kind of goes in a cycle where the people are faithful to God, then they become unfaithful and worship Baal, and then somebody has to come and turn their hearts back to Jehovah, and that keeps happening over and over until the prophet Samuel. Samuel's kind of seen as the intermediary figure between the judges and the kings of Israel. And one of the reasons he fills that void is because with him, there is a point, I think in 1 Samuel 7, where it just kind of says Baal worship stopped in Israel. Like it was just a hard wall that it hit. And because of Samuel's leadership, it's really expunged in the country for a couple generations. Of course, then when King Solomon comes to the throne, he, of course, marries many foreign wives, and they import not just Baal worship, but all kinds of worship, whether from Egypt or wherever his wife came from. And so it gets kicked back into gear at that point. But all through of that, like I said, it's kind of the weed that keeps coming up in the garden, and people that are faithful to the Lord have to go around and pull out the weed and take care of it. But it's never really predominant in the life of Israel until Jezebel shows up. We have a relation, I guess it would be like a great uncle by the name of Edwin, who lived down in Three Hills, and he's purported to have walked into the agriculture office at one point and said to the man at the counter, I'm having trouble with my grass in my lawn here. I was wondering, the only thing I really seems to be growing well. I think they were having a year like this where the summer was really hot, not a lot of rain. He says, the only thing that's really green there is the quack grass there. So do you have some seed for quack grass? Because I'm thinking I might as well just, go do the whole lawn that way. And the guy just kind of stared at, apparently, the weed inspector wasn't collecting seed for people to, try and take over their grass with it. But that was kind of essentially what Jezebel religiously did with the lawn of Israel, as it were. Whereas it had been a weed before that Baal worship had to be stamped out, suddenly she had just kind of gone the opposite direction and really encouraged it and really tried to supplant the worship of Jehovah in all of the northern kingdom of Israel. And apparently was quite successful in that Elijah then, when he gets up to confront these 450 priests, says, I'm the only one left worshiping Jehovah. Well, we'll find out in the next chapter, actually, that whether secretly or whether Elijah was, engaging in some rhetoric, there was still several thousand people that had remained faithful to Jehovah that whole time. But Jezebel stands out because she really brings worship of Baal to the forefront. She's really actually going on a conquest to eradicate these other priests. In the speech, and later in a cave, Elijah says, I'm the only one left. Jezebel's put all of the other faithful prophets or priests or whatever to Jehovah to the sword. She's killed them. So she's on a mission to really change the Jewish identity. And it's interesting, how did she do this? Well, she's the queen. She doesn't have any formal power, really, but she supports these prophets and priestesses of Baal. And it's interesting that she can do that with Ahab. Ahab, if you read the rest of his story, it's obvious that he's a very strong military leader. Like he's got leadership skills. He knows how to lead the army and commands several victories that are recorded in Scripture. There's even more, if we get into other sources. But for all his leadership skills and military prowess, it seems like Jezebel really rules the roost at home. When he gets home, he's really under her thumb. And I think it's particularly because of the influence of Baal worship. I think this has a lot to do with her looks, her sexuality. She holds sway over Ahab, I think, because he has given his heart to her. And we get just a hint of this, actually, in 2 Kings chapter 9, verse 30. This is just sort of a side reference, but basically at the end of her life, when Jezebel's life is threatened, Ahab has already gone by the wayside. Their son is now king in Israel. There's a coup that takes place. The next king who's going to supplant her son, Jehu, comes into the royal palace grounds and is looking to wipe out the king and all of his family, including the queen mother, Jezebel, at this point. And Jezebel's reaction when she sees this taking place, she goes and puts on her makeup. it's kind of a last-ditch effort to, well, maybe I can have the same relationship with this man as I had with my husband, is if I'm reading the situation right. And I think she recognizes that her influence, her source of power and authority, actually comes from her looks, her ability to influence whoever is in the true seat of power. And sometimes it's the king-makers that are even more powerful than the kings themselves. So Jezebel is crafty. She uses what she has to good advantage. She realizes, it's going to be a long time before Instagram comes on the scene. She doesn't need that to be an influencer. I don't even like that word. I read a thing this week. It was like anything that's kind of made up before you're like 15, you just see as part of the world. You're accustomed to that. And it's like anything after that point, this is new and strange. And one of those for me is the word influencer. I don't know why. It just grates against me. But she's an influencer, if anyone was, I guess. Well, what happened to her? Let's get to that. 1 Kings chapter 21. It's an insignificant incident recorded that brings with it very significant repercussions. And so one of the, getting back to Deuteronomy, as I said, the things that was compared there was an explicit command in Deuteronomy is don't sell your fields, essentially. Keep your land in the family. And the land was always portioned out by clans and then families, and that was your inheritance. That was the thing. That was kind of their way of taking care of people, was that you'd always have land. It wasn't a welfare state by any stretch, but that was sort of your social security, was always having a bit of land. And so what happens in chapter 21, we're not going to read it all, but basically King Ahab kind of has his eye on this really nice vineyard that's, within sight of the palace, but it's the traditional landholding of somebody else, so it can't be bought or sold. And so, but he approaches the guy anyway and says, "Do you want to sell it?" And the guy is faithful to the commands of the Lord, and says, "No, I can't. It's my family's possession." And Ahab goes home and sulks and pouts. There's no other way to describe it. But interestingly, the driving force at this point becomes Jezebel. She comes in the room and basically says, "Hey, are you a man or a mouse? Are you the king or aren't you? Just go and take it." And so she really prods Ahab into action at this point. He was probably just going to leave it alone, but she forces his hand. He actually kills the guy, takes the vineyard, and has what he wants. Well, once that's been done, then Elijah enters the scene and basically pronounces judgment on them. And he says, "I have found you because you have sold yourself to do evil in the eyes of the Lord." This is verse 20 of chapter 21. He says, "I'm going to bring disaster on you. I will wipe out your descendants and cut off from Ahab every last male in Israel, slave or free. I will make your house like that of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, and that of Baasha, son of Ahijah, because you have aroused my anger and caused Israel to sin." Israel went through a lot of dynasties in that kingdom. Even in the short period, I think maybe not even 100 years has passed, Ahab is already in the third dynasty of that kingdom, family succession there. But there's one more word here, not just about Ahab. We also have something for Jezebel. Verse 23, "And also concerning Jezebel, the Lord says, dogs will devour Jezebel by the wall of Jezreel. Dogs will eat those belonging to Ahab who die in the city, and the birds will feed on those who die in the country. They won't even get a proper burial." And particularly the fate of Jezebel, which does come true actually then in 2 Kings chapter 9, it is particularly dishonoring because, we think of dogs and we think of, a little black lab that's super cute and the family pet. Pet ownership was a lot different in that day. And dogs, particularly in Israel, were a shameful beast. Like we all know fairly well that Jewish people can't eat pork because that was an unclean animal. Well, worse than the pig was the dog. You didn't even want to touch the thing. And wild dogs roaming around, they are not friendly animals, and they are very they are dirty animals, not in the religious sense, but just in the hygienic sense. And so to have your corpse eaten by a dog was like the worst degradation that could possibly happen. And it comes true, unfortunately, for Jezebel. She has great influence, but the net result for her is not fame. It's all in the wrong direction. So not a particularly happy tale this morning, but I think we can learn from it that we all have influence, whether we have a title in front of our name or not, whether people give great deference to us or not. We all have, as believers especially, we have the Holy Spirit. We have the power of God dwelling in us, and if there's no other power or persuasiveness that we have access to, we have that. John reminds us of the words of Jesus, that the Holy Spirit will remind us of the teachings of Jesus Christ, remind us of his very words when we need it most. We all have influence. We can all do something profoundly positive, actually, when we are willing to be used by God in that way. And it's, I guess that's the great shame, is that, Jezebel in some ways was given a lot of opportunities, a lot of resources to be an influence for good, and she used it poorly. And other people, I think the good news story is other people with really limited resources have been able to have profound changes in the world. So here's another story from, it's sort of English history. It happens when they're in the 100 Years' War with France, and many of us are, of course, familiar with the name of Joan of Arc. A peasant girl, really unknown to the world there. Not a queen, not the daughter of a foreign king or something, but born to peasants in France, illiterate people without land, probably serfs at that time, almost as close as you could get to slavery in France. And Joan has a vision from God. And of course, we know the military fallout from that. She's sent to lead soldiers, even though women did not lead soldiers in that day. She leads an army, actually, and relieves the siege of Orleans, which is kind of a pivotal battle site in the 100 Years' War, and it eventually brings victory to France. And she's given that recognition from the King of France himself, uncrowned as he was at that point. And she does this all at the age of 14. A mere girl, much like Queen Anne, actually, when she got married, the same age. So she's a peasant. She's illiterate. She's a woman in a time when women were given very little authority. She's young. She's 14, and yet she's executed by the English in the end, but she's ultimately canonized by the Catholic Church, turned into a saint. She has great sway and influence in her culture despite having very limited resources with which to sway people. And to me, it's just a picture that, when we realize that we've received something from God, when we have the power of the Holy Spirit in us, we can hold great influence, actually. Whether we've been given a title or not, we can change the world around us. Well, how can we do that? I think one of the easiest things that anybody can do to have influence that way is just to be a friend to somebody, to show simple acts of kindness to someone who maybe needs that, whether they're alone, whether they just feel friendless and isolated. It's something that we can all do. Sometimes we can start a trend or a campaign. Lots of social justice causes that we hear about on social media or even in more traditional forms of print media. I remember actually in Bible school, my brother, right before I'd left, he had come home from college and he'd just moved out of a science program into philosophy. And so he was well done with his chemistry classes, and so he had to buy a lab coat for these chemistry classes, I guess, for their lab work. And he says, "I don't need this anymore," and he gave it to me. He knew I was going to a Bible school, and you don't have to attend there to appreciate how few chemistry classes I actually had to take in that curriculum. But I had a lab coat, and I thought, well, I'm going to put this to use. So I think it was the first fall, I forget, I just picked a random day, and I put on my lab coat and went to class. And anytime anybody would ask me why I was wearing a lab coat, I would just say, oh, well, it's lab coat day. Didn't you hear the announcement? Well, I kept doing this, and I'd wear it periodically, every month or two or something like that, and just for a joke. Well, the next year, one of my classmates, she brought her lab coat. And so she said, well, you have to tell me the day before, because when it's lab coat day, and we can wear it together. I think it snowballed by my third year. We had quite a few people that would wear lab coats. And it was like, I just did it for a joke, but for some reason it became the purview of student life eventually. Just for fun, we'd all wear lab coats. But it was interesting to me. It was like, I was just a kid, I was an 18-year-old kid. I didn't have any, student leadership aspirations. I was just wearing a lab coat for a joke, but it started a trend. And sometimes that's all it takes. What's something else we can do? I think sometimes we can just resist. We can hang on to our beliefs. We don't have to get up on a soapbox and preach. Maybe you don't even need to buy the t-shirt. We just need to remain faithful to the Lord. And that was an important point actually for Elijah. If you look at his life and the record in Scripture, I think a pretty valid case can be made for the fact that he probably suffered from depression. And so he has this big high, literally, on Mount Tabor, where he faces off against these 450 prophets and defeats them. And then he literally has a low. He comes down from the mountain, gets his life threatened, and he books it for a cave off in the wilderness. He goes into hiding, and we have the record of what happens in the cave, and it's basically, poor me, God, why have you done this to me? Why don't you just kill me now? I'm the only one left that's faithful to you. God says, no, actually there are still 7,000 in Israel that have not bowed their knee to Baal. They are still faithful to God. And that was a pretty important point, not just for Elijah, but for God, that somebody was willing to resist the current of false worship in Israel. Somebody was willing to stand up for what was right in their own way, even if it was just, I'm going to live my life this way. It makes a profound statement. I don't know if you've ever been in that kind of awkward social position where it's like, I'm not telling anybody how to live their life. I'm just refusing to act in concert with everybody else around me. And people get offended. People get offended because, well, do you think you're better than us? And it's like, well, no, this is just not the way I want to live. And that resistance, it can be pretty important too.